Well, so there is a change. I found something out that in a lot of churches, the last Sunday before Lent is the Sunday where they talk about the Transfiguration. Now that's a good fancy word, right? Transfiguration is another one of those words that we use, and it actually appears in the Bible. It's a pretty good translation. But you know what a figure is, right? It's the way you look. It's a appearance. And, you know, you use it transform or transition. It means changing. So transfiguration means looking different. And that's what this reading is about. It's about a day when Jesus looked different. But before we talk about what exactly happened that day, I want to talk about the person who comes across in this story, maybe not as the center, but one of the people who talks, and that's Peter. You know, Peter's interesting to me because unlike most of the people in the Bible, you actually get a sense of what his personality is like. You know, most of the people in the Bible, even ones who are mentioned again and again, you don't necessarily get a sense of the kind of person they might have been. I mean, usually you would know that they were followers of God or they were opposed to God, but I'm talking about the kind of the way you get to know a person, you know, in a church or in your community. Peter was a great leader. Peter was actually the very first Christian. The name Peter means the rock, the cornerstone. And Peter is the first person who made the confession of faith that we make every week. He's the cornerstone for the whole church. The song we sang, Sanctuary, about making us a sanctuary, that image, one of the images of the Bible that the Bible uses for the church, is a building, a temple made of stones, living stones, our hearts. Peter was the very first person who put his heart down before Jesus to build that temple, that sanctuary. And that's what his name means. Now, beyond that, Peter went on to be a leader in the church. He went on to preach and travel and was killed for his faith, for his proclamation of the faith. Not just because he believed, but because he told people that he believed, even when he wasn't supposed to. And so there's an image of this great leader. What the Bible brings out, though, is that Peter's personality comes across pretty clearly. And I think you could say a good word to describe Peter would be schmuck. Peter was kind of a schmuck from almost beginning to end. Not beginning to end. When the time comes and he's called to be that leader, when he receives the Spirit, he's the first person to get up and preach. He gives the first sermon. But the New Testament, the stories about Peter, are designed pretty clearly to point out that Peter isn't a great leader because he was the smartest guy. He's not a great leader because he was the wisest or the boldest or the most moral or courageous. They make the point that, like a lot of people in the Bible, God picked Peter to lead despite the fact that he was a schmuck. And of all the schmucky stories about Peter, this is one of the schmuckiest. See, Peter comes across in this story, in this scene where Jesus appears to him. And what you gotta, you know, I've talked to multiple times lately about how when people met Jesus, he wasn't glowing. He wasn't obviously divine or holy or anything. You know, he just looked like a regular guy. Well, this is the exception to that story. This is the point where Jesus really was glowing. They say that really clearly. And in the language they have, all they can say, they were whiter than any bleach could get him. His clothes shined. And Moses and Elijah, who were the two great prophets, the two greatest men of God who had ever lived, appeared next to Jesus. Part of that is because some people thought that Jesus was like a reincarnation of Moses or a reincarnation of Elijah. And so their appearance is a way of saying he's not those guys, he's somebody new. But it also confirms that connection that Jesus has. And in this moment, Peter's standing there, and he opens his mouth. Peter had this habit of opening his mouth, of jumping in, of being the first to leap into any situation. You know, they say, fools go where angels fear to tread. You ever hear that saying? That was Peter. He was the fool. And here, he opens his mouth. And what does he say? He says, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, 3 like little houses. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And then it says he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Now, I want you to remember there were 3 people there. It says there was Peter, James, and John. James and John, they didn't know what to say either. So what did they say? Nothing. They didn't know what to say, so they had the common sense to keep their mouths shut. Peter didn't know what to say, but apparently it didn't occur to him that maybe he should just be quiet. He opens his mouth. I have this really dumb idea. Let's build houses for these guys. Well, what is that? And honestly, even if you read the scholars and the commentaries, they don't really know what Peter was after either. And it's pretty clear, though, that even in the way they put this, he didn't know what to say. So even the gospel writers want to make sure you understand that whatever Peter was about, it was a pretty dumb comment. So Peter has this schmuck moment there, up on the mountain. Why? Well, to understand what was going on, you can get a little hint if you go back a chapter or 2, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can go back and you can actually read it in Mark 8. Before this happens, Peter had just opened up his mouth before. Remember how I said Peter was the first person to make that confession of faith we say every week? The first person to say, Jesus, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of God. Well, that's what happened right before this. Jesus is going along, and he asks his disciples a question. Who do you say that I am? Now, none of them maybe know what to say, but Peter, he's the one who takes the chance. And he says, well, I think you're the Messiah. He doesn't say, I think. He says, you are the Messiah. That's a big risk, right? They've been waiting for the Messiah for hundreds and hundreds of years. And to have this guy who doesn't look like the Messiah be the one, Peter's taking a chance. He's really putting himself out there. And Jesus says, you're right. You're right. That's who I am. Maybe that's part of the reason Peter decided to take a chance later on opening his mouth, because it really worked out well for him just before this. And then what happens is, Jesus says, you're right, I'm the Messiah. And the Messiah was the king, right? The person who's going to rule and bring peace to the world and make everything great and establish a kingdom. And of course, if you're the first guy to sign up with the guy who's going to be king, you probably figure you have a pretty good spot in this kingdom, right? Part of what's going on with the disciples is that they're not signing up with Jesus purely because he's a great guy. They're also trying to be the first to get on board. Like the first investor in Google or Microsoft. It's great if you can get on the ground floor. And Peter is the guy who's gotten on the ground floor, right? He's the right-hand man. So he figures he's got a pretty good future ahead of him. So what Jesus says next is kind of a problem for him. Jesus says, yeah, I'm the Messiah, but I'm not going to set up this big kingdom. Angels aren't going to come down and conquer the world on my behalf. No, I'm going to Jerusalem, which is what the Messiah was supposed to do. And when I get there, I'm going to get killed. I'm going to be tortured and executed. I'm going to be put in the grave, and then I'm going to rise again from the dead 3 days later. Now, for the disciples, this is out of left field. I mean, this is totally unexpected. They did not see this coming. But they have the additional problem. The word disciple means follower, right? It means somebody who follows Jesus. Well, they're following Jesus, and Jesus is going to get tortured and killed. suddenly things look a little not so great for Peter. And if he's the number one follower, who's going to be the first to have to go? As a matter of fact, that's what happened to Peter. Peter really did get crucified. There aren't many disciples. I mean, there's stories about what happened to them, but not many of them are verifiable. And the story of Peter's crucifixion is one of the ones that's most, I guess, historical. Can't be sure, I guess. It's not in the Bible. But Peter followed Jesus' footsteps. At this time, though, he's not so excited about that. And he says, "Oh, Jesus, God forbid anything like that would ever happen to you." And Jesus gets angry at him and says, Get away from me, Satan. Calls him Satan, the tempter. Right? Satan's the person who's trying to tempt you away from the right path. He's telling Peter, "You're trying to tempt me away." The same way that Satan did at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, where he said, "You can have kingdoms and glory and all this stuff." And Jesus said, "No, that's not what God wants for me." Jesus does the same thing to Peter now. That's not what God wants for me. So Peter has to start to process this fact that that's not what God wants for him either. And he's not going to get the kingdom. Well, not the kingdom necessarily, but the prime ministership or something like that. He's not going to get the palace next door to Jesus' palace. He's not going to get the, whatever, principality or something like that. You know, he's got a future that's a lot less exciting, glorious, pretty, rich than what he expected he was going to have. And up on the mountain, when he sees that glory, when he says, "I want to build those houses for you," what do you do in a house, in a dwelling? You live in it, right? You stay there. What this reading, this thing that Peter says means is, let's just stay on the mountaintop. Let's just not come down. We have the glory of heaven, Moses and Elijah. This is great. Let's just not go back down the mountain. Because down the mountain is going to be not nearly as nice as where we are here. And let's just forget about that. Let's just go straight to the glory. And when he says that, it's kind of interesting what happens. They vanish. And the voice from heaven opens up and says, "This is my son, listen to him." Well, what were they supposed to listen? They were supposed to listen to what Jesus had already told them. That they had to go through that. He had to go through it. And if they were his followers, they were going to have to follow him through those hard times. And even after that, they still don't get, they go down the mountaintop wondering what the rising from the dead meant. They still didn't get it after all that. Even when Jesus went to the cross, they didn't get it. They were still surprised to see him rise, even though he kept saying over and over again, "We're going to rise. I'm going to rise from the dead." They didn't get it. And so all they wanted was to stay on the mountain. Now, isn't this the way we are too, though? It's hard to grasp when you go through a hard time, when you're in the midst of it, or when you see it coming. It's hard to grasp there's something ahead. You know, the future that Jesus has is not one that we can really understand. We talk about rising from the dead or eternal life or these things, but we don't really know what that means. And in those moments where it's hard to really believe, when we see those easy times that we're in those good moments, it's easy to want to stay there. But if you stay there, you miss out, right? For me, right now, I think about kids and how rapidly my kids are growing, how fast they've come along, and how nice it would be sometimes to stop where we are. You know, but if you stop in that moment, that moment of childbirth, you hold the new baby, if you just stay there, it's a wonderful moment, but you miss everything else. You never get to see graduation. And if you miss graduation or stay at graduation, you never get to see your child grow up, become an amazing person, do amazing things. And And if you stop at that moment that some people call the prime of life, you never get to the point where you see your legacy and the generations after you coming on ahead. Every moment, even the best moments, even those wonderful moments, there's more to come. And the truth is, all those great moments that we remember, that we think, oh, I'd like to stay there, you don't get to them without going through trial and struggle, do you? The moment you hold a new baby is preceded by an awful lot of much less pleasant effort. Graduation is maybe not so hard for most people, but it isn't easy. You have to struggle to get to that point. Career, life, raising a family, having grandkids, whatever it is, those beautiful moments that kind of get lit up in our memory are the result of a struggle. And the truth is, they're the beginning, or the precursor, I hate to use a word like that, but they're the prelude to another struggle that's coming. And people just don't live in those moments where everything is celebration all the time. And if you did, you'd just be frozen. The path that Jesus walked got easier and harder. He had good days, he had some really bad days. But each of the days he walked led him to where God was taking him, which is beyond what any of us can imagine. And the whole message of Jesus, the story of Jesus, of his life and his trials and his death and his resurrection, they're telling us that even when we're in those times, when things are hard, even when we're in those times where we can't see a way forward, that there is hope for us. Whether we know it or not, or can see it or not, we still have that hope. And so we don't need to try to stay on the mountain. We don't need to live in those occasional moments. What we do is to remember them so that we have the strength to go on. The moment, that transfiguration moment, that moment of glory, was there to strengthen the people who saw it and to strengthen us, so that as they walked through that difficult, that terrible journey with Jesus, which it just starts here, as they take that journey, they have the memory of the glory, of the joy, to help move forward. I'm sure sometimes in their path, on that day when they stood before the cross, that memory seemed pretty distant. But little did they know that at the cross they were closer to God's glory than they ever had been. And so for each of us, whether we're in that moment of celebration, whether we're in that moment of trial, we just need to remember that none of our times last forever. That good and bad will pass away as the world sees it, but that what we have ahead, and not just ahead in heaven, that is our goal, but the peace that God promises doesn't have to just exist in that land, that world we can't understand, and that God's peace is promised to us. And so whatever your trial, take heart, be strong, and trust in the Lord. Let's stand together. We're going to sing an invitation song. I need thee every hour. It's about that presence of God in those times when we can't do it ourselves.
Thank you.